Well, no doubt you're aware that there is proposed new legislation, this Misinformation Disinformation Bill. We've covered it a number of times here on the Aussie Wire. We encourage you to make a submission before that deadline closed a little while ago. We encouraged you to write in and tell the government what you thought about their proposed new legislation. Well, the good news is 23,000 submissions were made. We can't claim credit for all of them, of course, but this is a topic that has sparked a lot of interest and a lot of response. But who in the world is going to sit down and read 23,000 responses to find out what's in them and report that to the public? Well, nobody. But someone who has read some of the ones that have been released already is Crispin Rovere. I apologise, I've butchered your last name. Welcome to the Aussie Wire.
Thanks, Topher.
Now, you were on once before talking about your own personal experiences with getting unbanked, your bank accounts frozen, all of that. That's not the topic for today. You were tweeting and caught my eye. I saw that you have actually, and I don't know what has to be wrong with someone to decide voluntarily to do this, but after the first 150 of those 23,000 responses were released, you actually sat down and read them. Are you mad?
Yes. But no, I think it's the least I could do. For people to sit down and write their own submission in their own words, their own feelings about what is a very important topic, something that I think we should all think about and develop our own position on. It's the least I could do is to actually read what the people had actually written. And it also gives a sense of the arguments as to the for and against, mostly against, for why such a legislation is being proposed and why its implications are so severe.
Now, there was a lot of reporting around the fact that only 150 were initially released out of the 23,000. You've got a more measured perspective on that than what I've heard elsewhere. Can you share with us your thoughts on why that might be and what the process might be going forward?
Yeah, I'm a bit more sympathetic to the poor people who are working on the committee. So they have to go through each and every one, make sure that they're legitimate submissions, draw from that some of the main points and summarize them for the politicians who will be debating them in committee hearings and so forth. Because when you write a submission, it is taken seriously. And so they need to do that on an individual basis, and they'll usually do that in a chronological order. And so they also will have data integrity concerns. If they just dump it all on the website, it could break down. They could lose some submissions. So there's a process of approval. Like, one person will read it, another person will tick it off. So it's actually understandable that they're not going to get 23,000 submissions all in one go. I think in a rolling basis, it makes sense. The real issue is that they didn't release any until the middle of September, a day after Parliament finished. So what would normally happen is that they would deal with it promptly. They would get some submissions up, and then the parliamentarians could debate and question and cite the submissions and throw things across the dispatch box. And one would imagine that if most of the submissions had been positive, perhaps they would have got them up a bit more swiftly, so the government could get on its dispatch and say, look, the people are behind it. But because the response was overwhelmingly negative, they started being dumped on a Friday afternoon after all the parliamentarians had gone home.
The games that get played. Now, you've read the first week's dump, the 150 there. You've read those. You've had a quick look at the second week's dump as well. You just said they're overwhelmingly opposed to the legislation. What are some of the arguments that you're seeing? What's some of the reasoning that you're seeing being presented in these submissions?
Yeah, well, there's multiple stages. So first of all, whether it's even an important issue. We hear a lot at the kind of elite level that misinformation, disinformation is a grave threat to Western society. Well, that's not the conversation that most of us have at the dinner table and the issues that we face. So there's a question as to whether this is even important at all.
Sure.
Then there is how misinformation is defined. And then, of course, most importantly, who gets to define it? In this case, the government. And then the exemptions in the proposed bill. So the government is exempt, certain media outlets are exempt, academia is exempt, and yet ordinary citizens are covered by this proposed legislation. So the argument being put forward is, well, why is the government allowed to lie to us? If misinformation and disinformation is so grave and dangerous, why are they exempting themselves from it? Shouldn't that be something that we're all covered by? And then there is how the legislation will be applied. Will be applied fairly and evenly in accordance with the law, in a balanced way where it doesn't matter where you sit on the political spectrum, it'll be applied equally. Well, a lot of the submissions are simply pointing to the past and say, okay, a lot of things that were shut down, that have been removed, where people have been deplatformed, those were objectively true things that they were saying, and yet because it was politically inappropriate or politically incorrect, they were being deplatformed. And then, of course, ACMA itself may change its views on different topics, and there's no recourse for those people that have suffered, sanction of that. And then, of course, there is the chilling effect that people are afraid of as well, where the platforms will have to self-censor to avoid penalty. So it's not just ACMA coming along and saying, okay, you've breached this, you've breached this. It's that they set the kind of playing field, the sense of what's appropriate, and then the social media companies themselves will, deplatform, censor, derank, and shadow ban. And people are really concerned about that a lot of things won't even be tested under law because the social media companies will take a draconian response. And these issues are coming up again and again. And then, of course, there is the core principle that a lot of submissions are simply saying, look, freedom of speech is really important. The antidote to bad ideas isn't censorship, isn't persecution. It's good ideas. It's the marketplace. And if someone is wrong about something, if someone has an ignorant view, then they have an opportunity to be educated. Persecuting them isn't going to push them, to some kind of enlightened position. It's the open debate. It's being exposed to different ideas, and then they can change their opinion if that opinion is wrong, or if they have a point, they can share that and get support. So that's the threat to democracy is the main thrust of all that. But all of these points above are the consistent view.
Now, you've implied that there might be a handful of submissions of that 150 that you have sifted through that were actually in support. What was the gist of those? What were the arguments contained there?
I could put them into two categories, and I use categories broadly because there's only a few.
Right.
Those that were government agencies and supported directly by the government, they might put in points about, this needs clarification, but we support the bill, that sort of thing. So, of course, they're not going to be openly against it. And then those that feel that the misinformation is genuinely harmful, that people can be misled to do things that are self-harming. They can imbibe bleach or something because they're convinced that it's going to cure a disease. And then also, if there are issues relating to information that they were receiving that was incorrect. So the idea that Wi-Fi towers might cause cancer, or those kinds of things where the actual working of the country would be undermined because of people's misinformation, disinformation. And we actually saw an article in the ABC where people were advocating that news organizations should be included in the bill as well, specifically targeting Murdoch Press, Sky News. So these arguments in favor aren't necessarily the broader perspective of what's good for democracy. It's usually those that have a particular political slant who don't necessarily want the other side to voice their concerns.
Well, that's the nature of censorship. That's how it gets used throughout history. We've always seen that becomes true very quickly. Once the tools of censorship are in place, they very quickly become a partisan weapon from one side to the other. Well, Crispin, thank you so much for the work that you've done reading through those. Do you plan to keep reading through them as they keep getting dropped? It must be an incredibly time-consuming thing, or is this you've sampled it now and you're satisfied and that's it?
I'll continue to sample. I've been unwell recently, so I've had more time on my hands to do it, and I won't have as much time going forward. But I think they're really good. Some people have even put in memes and things as part of their submission, so it's kept it entertaining at the very least. Not something you normally see in a government review. And I hope that the government and the committees take them very seriously, because the response is overwhelmingly, we don't want this. So I hope it's taken seriously, and people should go and check out the submissions for themselves. Some of them are very interesting. Well,
Crispin, we'll put your social media handles into the description of this video so that people can follow you and get the word from the horse's mouth, so to speak, no offense, and can follow you as you continue to look through these submissions and report on those. But for today, thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks for having me, Toba.